Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Plato's Crito dialogue and Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail to think about the issue of civil disobedience. Of course, for us in our contemporary times, civil disobedience is a very turbulent and politically controversial issue. I can say right now that as I'm recording, there is quite a big No Kings protest going on essentially outside of my house, right? So it's something that has been in our popular consciousness at least since 2020, the Palestine encampments, and now these large No Kings rallies, which are some of the biggest political protests in United States history. And this is not just a United States phenomenon, but it's something that's true all over the world, is that political protests are bigger and more controversial than they have ever been. So this week we're going to use the resources of philosophy in order to try to think about the rightness or wrongness of political protest. Let's start out by returning to Plato. So we're going to pick things up where we left off after the Apology. Socrates is denounced as guilty and he's awaiting his execution in his jail cell. The Crito dialogue depicts one of Socrates' friends, namely Crito, coming to his jail cell, bribing his the guard of the jail cell, and saying to Socrates at this moment, like, hey, let's just get out of here. Right? You can still live a totally different life. You don't need to, sacrifice your own life because of philosophy or whatever. You can continue to practice philosophy elsewhere, right? So let's use my Crito's considerable resources to bust you out of here so that you don't need to die, right? And Socrates responds to Crito in a quite interesting way, right? And basically says, okay, well, if you can convince me that it's the right thing to do, to bust out of prison, to knowingly violate Athenian laws, then I'll do it. I'll go with you, right? But I don't think that you're going to convince me that that's the right thing to do. And Socrates develops an argument that he thinks shows why any knowing violation of the law is morally wrong. Socrates' argument goes like this. Socrates thinks it's always wrong to do harm. In other words, there are no circumstances, situations in which harming another person is ever morally justified, right? Socrates exemplifies through this quote in the Crito, quote, neither to do wrong nor to return a wrong is ever correct, nor is doing harm in return for harm done. So Socrates is willing to concede to Crito, yes, Athens has harmed him by imprisoning him under false pretenses, and also for finding him guilty when they shouldn't have found him guilty of corrupting the youth, and so on, right? But nevertheless, Socrates holds on to this moral principle that it's never okay to return a wrong with another wrong, right? So Socrates can accept, okay, Athens has harmed me, but that doesn't really have anything to do with the question of whether I should harm Athens, right? Socrates furthermore believes that to violate the law is always to do harm, in particular do harm to the state to which he has sworn his allegiance. And Socrates recounts all the things that he owes to Athens and to Athenian democracy. Namely that, of course, in a society like Sparta or what have you, that there could have never been a Socrates, right? Socrates could have only emerged in ancient Athens. Athens, and he in fact fought to defend Athens, and so believes that to knowingly violate the law is to do harm, right? Now that's interesting because in a way the apology is like itself a case of civil disobedience, or at least one can interpret it that way, right? They're telling him not to do philosophy, and he's saying, screw you, I'm going to do philosophy anyway, right? But I think that we can interpret this in a way to make it consistent, namely that Socrates thinks he's not guilty, right? That's what lets him make all of the arguments that he makes in the Apology, is that he's not saying, I violated the laws, but that's okay because X, Y, and Z, right? No, to the contrary, he's asserting, I did not corrupt the youth. I was not impious. I did not make the weaker argument the stronger, right? So even though the Apology is often interpreted within the tradition of civil disobedience, right, at the same time, Socrates doesn't actually believe that he's violating any kind of law, right? So step 3, the conclusion of 1 and 2, because it's always wrong to do harm, and because to violate the law is always to do harm, it's always wrong to violate the law, right? So Socrates ends up thinking, in essence, that Crito wasn't listening to him in the Apology, right? Socrates doesn't fear death, right? He doesn't even know that dying is a harm, right? So he's not willing to break Athens' laws and to escape from Athens with Crito, right? So that's Plato's very hardline case against any form of civil disobedience. But we have a really interesting philosophical tradition in the United States that argues in a very strong and principled way in favor of civil disobedience. And we can get that from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, right? As the title itself announces, right? This is itself written in a jail cell after organizing an act of civil disobedience, right? And Martin Luther King Jr. is explaining why it is that he believes that these forms of civil disobedience are justified, right? And we have a number of really, really important quotes from this text, right? One is that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, right? And we really need to try to understand this idea, because I think that many people accept it on a surface level, but don't really understand the full ramifications of what King is saying here, right? In other words, if we live in a society in which the most politically disadvantaged or marginalized group of people, their rights can be systematically violated, then even if you don't belong to that group, you could, right? The dominant group could always change their ideas about who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group, right? Your own rights become conditional whenever you live in a society that allows for exceptions, marginalization, oppression, things of that nature, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. is arguing that everyone in a given society ought to take interest in the redress of injustice, right? So in other words, you don't need to be a victim of political oppression in order to be motivated to civil disobedience, right? All you need is the recognition of a kind of injustice, right? So King is going to develop the argument that civil disobedience is not only permissible, but even morally obligatory whenever you encounter situations of injustice, right? The next quote explains why you're obligated towards civil disobedience, right? A lot of people take the attitude of like, well, in the long arc of history, right, maybe everything will work out in the end, right? That history is inevitably bent towards greater inclusion, more rights, things of that nature, right? Arguably, our more recent history has given us reason to doubt that, right, in a very concrete way. I mean, Americans have less rights than they had 20 or 30 years ago, right? And so it doesn't seem like a given, just that as historical time progresses, that we're going to receive more and more political rights. But nevertheless, King also provides an argument to this effect, right? Namely, that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. So you can't simply, hope to wait it out, as it were, right? Hope for your children or their children and so on to live in a society without oppression, right? All oppression is ended by being demanded by the oppressed, right? And that's what civil disobedience is, right? And so King argues that unjust laws actually shouldn't be morally motivating at all. In other words, if a law is unjust, then the fact that a law tells you to do something, right, should count for nothing to you, right? King says, I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all, right? In other words, you have no obligation whatsoever to follow the law whenever you are witness to an injustice. Indeed, you are positively obligated to rectify that injustice, right? And this is a really interesting and radical aspect of King's view, right? Where he argues that the greatest obstacle to racial justice is the white moderate, right? So not even like, the Klansman or, the unapologetic racist or something like that, right? No, to the contrary, that what King sees as the greatest obstacle to racial justice are what he would call, I think, the mainstream of American society, right? Who love order more than they love justice. In other words, they don't want to be inconvenienced, etc., by protests, right? And they don't want to be scared by protests, right? And that they would prefer an unjust status quo to any action that would seek to change the nature of the status quo, right? So in other words, they seek kind of what King calls a kind of negative peace, which is just the absence of conflict, rather than a positive peace, which is itself the presence of justice. When you think about contemporary protests, do you tend to agree more with Plato or more with King? Do you think that these protests are harmful and therefore illegitimate? Or do you agree with King that these protests are a legitimate reaction to perceived injustice and so therefore are fundamentally correct? I'm very interested to hear your perspective, and I will see you in the next video.